Hey everyone, now welcome back to another episode of Heebie-Jeebies TV. Now I know it's been a little bit of a while since I last made a video. That's only because life has been extremely crazy, but we're now back. We're filming consistently, and today's story is actually a pretty crazy one. I actually heard about it maybe like less than a year ago, and I've been wanting to make a video on it just because of how insane the story is. Now, this story actually hits close to home for me, and that's because it actually takes place in Markham, which is actually a suburb of Toronto, and I actually spent some time living in that area, so I'm quite familiar with it. Now, this type of neighborhood is a very family-centered sort of neighborhood. There's a lot of affluent people around here. And there is quite a large Asian community here as well. Now, today's story has something to do with just complex family dynamics, and Jennifer Pan's family was a little bit complicated. So, this would probably make more sense if you come from a very strict family where there are a lot of rules, there's a lot of pressure for you to perform well when it comes to your studies, and it just sometimes feels like it's never enough. I know I can definitely relate to that feeling. You're constantly being pushed to do more and more and more, even though you might feel like you're doing your best. And unfortunately, not everyone knows how to deal with this sort of pressure, this sort of anxiety. And in Jennifer Pan's case, it actually consumed her and made her do some really extreme and crazy things. So Jennifer was born in Toronto on June 17th, 1986, and both of her parents were actually Vietnamese immigrants. Their names were Vic and Huy Pan, and when they first immigrated to Canada, they actually lived in a different suburb of Toronto called Scarborough, and then eventually made their way over to Markham. So like most immigrants to Canada or to any new country really, their goal was to work really, really hard in order to not just make a better life for themselves, but for their children and the future generations to come. So Jennifer's parents were a very hardworking family. Their parents would take multiple jobs. They would take any job they could find really in order to make sure that Jennifer and her brother Felix had a very bright future ahead of them. So by 2004, Jennifer's parents had worked really hard. They had saved as much money as they could. They had actually saved up enough money to buy a single family home in Markham, specifically in a smaller section of Markham called Unionville. And to give you an idea of how much they were making, both parents were actually even also able to afford luxury cars. They each had a Lexus and a Mercedes as well. Now, this area of Markham, specifically Unionville, is actually a very wealthy pocket of Markham. To give you a better idea, the houses here today in that area go for approximately 1.7, 1.8, and that's to get like a decent looking single family home. That's likely going to be the minimum you're going to spend, if not somewhere in the 2.2, 2.4 range for something quite nice. So with this success, Jennifer's parents now were putting even more pressure on Jennifer. So if they could do it, if they could become successful, there was basically no reason that Jennifer couldn't do the same or better for herself. So as Jennifer and Felix were growing up, the pressure that their parents put on them just kept growing. There was a continuous amount of pressure for them to perform to the best of their abilities, to be high performers, to basically almost be perfect. Now, there's actually a term for this, and it's actually called tiger parents or tiger parenting. And scholars refer this to the sort of parenting where parents push their children to achieve academic excellence and even extracurricular excellence. Now, the reason for the name tiger is because it specifically refers to Asian families, Asian parents. So the tiger is a reference to Asia because that's where they're from. So it draws that parallel there referring to the idea or to the stereotype that Asian parents are usually the most strict, therefore they do what they call tiger parenting. And from what I've experienced, I had a few Asian friends when I was growing up, and I can tell you from what I've heard, from what I've seen, that Asian households tend to have very, very strict rules. I used to think I had a strict home, but I had some other friends that were 10 times stricter. They were under lockdown almost all the time. They couldn't get anything under like an A. If they had an A minus, there would be disappointment, sometimes even consequences. So I can definitely understand the type of pressure Jennifer was under at this time. So her parents were so strict on her to the point that by the time Jennifer was only 4 years old, she was taking piano lessons and skating lessons almost every single day. And on top of that, her parents actually had her join the band at school where she was actually playing the flute. And her parents just kept her so busy with school and extracurricular activities that they basically were with her 24/7. They would pick her up, drop her off. Jennifer had almost no time to herself. Now, when it came to growing up and experiencing the normal things, I guess you could say, that most teenagers would get to do, like dating or going to parties, hanging out with their friends, going to the mall, none of that was even close to being an option for Jennifer. Dating was absolutely not a possibility for her. She was not allowed to do anything on her own. Her parents really thought that letting her have this freedom would be a major distraction from her studies, and that just was not an option to them. Jennifer had to focus on her grades to make sure that she would excel in her future. So there was a turning point for Jennifer, and it happened when she was in grade 8. Up until then, she had been very committed to her studies. She was actually trying, she was studying, she wanted to do her parents proud. But when grade 8 graduation came around, there was this expectation that she was going to win valedictorian and that she was going to win several other awards for having high grades. But when that day came, Jennifer didn't win valedictorian and she didn't win any awards either. So this did something to her in her head. This shifted her mindset. It went from her wanting to study and wanting to do her best in order to make herself and her parents proud to actually feeling like, what's the point? If I'm going to study this hard, if I'm going to have no life, if I'm going to focus all of my attention on studying and still not be rewarded for it, then what is the point? So with this new attitude and mindset, she went on into high school, and sadly, her grades started to just go downwards from there. Her parents thought that she was excelling, that she was doing well, but in reality, Jennifer was averaging about a 70% average, which is not terrible. Here in Canada, that's like a B minus, a B. It's not the best, but it's also not the worst. But Jennifer knew that a 70 average just wasn't going to cut it with her parents. She was actually terrified of telling them what her actual grades were. This actually pushed her to do some questionable things just because she felt like she had so much pressure. And I'm not saying all this to excuse what she ended up doing, but I can definitely relate and understand the amount of anxiety, nervousness, and pressure she felt throughout all of this. So in high school, she actually started faking her grades. She would start faking report cards. She would be photoshopping these grades. She would be cutting, copying, and pasting, gluing things, just basically forging her grades in order to make her parents think that she was a straight A student when in reality she was averaging in the 70s. Now, this was all fine at the beginning. She was getting away with it. There was no real consequences to this until it came time to apply for university. Now, initially, she had been accepted with a preconditional offer to Ryerson University, which is in Toronto. And this acceptance was actually based on her grade 12 classes, especially on her calculus class. Now, sadly, she actually ended up failing calculus and had her offer taken away. So with her acceptance to university now taken away from her, Jennifer's anxiety was at an all-time high. The only thing she could think of was to continue doing what she had been doing in high school, and this basically meant to fake her report card for grade 12 and to also fake her acceptance letter into Ryerson. She makes it look as legit as possible. She cuts and pastes logos. She forges all of these documents. She's forging signatures in the acceptance letter. She's making it look as realistic as possible. And somehow she was able to fool her parents. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are asking, okay, fine, I guess you can kind of get away with faking a few documents, but how do you fake going to university? How do you fake going to class? Well, Jennifer thought this out, and surprisingly, it ended up working for her for quite a few years. So once classes began in the fall, Jennifer actually would leave the house every morning. She would leave her house in Markham and pretend that she was going to downtown Toronto, which was about a 45-minute commute if you're taking the bus or the train. And she would be fooling her parents basically. But in reality, she was actually working at a restaurant, and she was also teaching piano lessons as a private teacher. Now, to make this even more convincing, she would actually go and watch videos of the programs that she was supposed to be taking at Ryerson. She would watch YouTube videos or just any videos online that she could on certain subjects, and she would fill books with notes and notes and notes of these subjects to actually make it look convincing. Now, to continue this lie, she actually was basically forced to continue lying and making a bigger and bigger web of lies. Now, part of her original plan was to be accepted into Toronto U. Now, if you don't know, Toronto U is basically considered Ivy League in Canada, and Ryerson is still a university. It's a good university, but it's not as prestigious as Toronto U is. So what she intended to do was to originally get accepted to U of T, but because she wasn't, she had told her father that she was going to do 2 years at Ryerson U, get some really, really good grades, do some impressive volunteering, extracurricular activities, and then apply for the pharmacology program at Toronto U after 2 years so she could get transferred, transfer her credits, and then finish with the diploma from U of T. So when it came time to apply for her transfer to Toronto U, she actually ended up telling her parents, obviously, that she had gotten accepted, but not just that, that she had actually also won scholarships. Now, to continue faking this lie, she actually continued on with watching videos and taking a whole bunch of notes down, but she actually went out of her way to look up the syllabus online and see what courses were being taken in that program, and then went to go buy secondhand textbooks of those courses. She really did make it look as legit as possible, just out of fear and not wanting to disappoint her parents. You could imagine the amount of stress that she was feeling at this point, to feel like she needed to basically live a double life. So eventually, Jennifer ends up dating this guy called Daniel. Now, Daniel was not new to her. She actually went to high school with him. They knew each other pretty well, but her parents never liked him. They kind of saw him as a drifter, as a nobody, someone that was probably in the wrong social class, that wasn't really going to do anything with their life. So her parents kind of made it known that they didn't really like him. Unfortunately, this is the guy that Jennifer really, really did like, and so they started dating. To make her relationship easier, she actually came up with another lie to tell her parents. Now, because she was living in Markham, it was an annoying amount of time to commute from Markham to the university. So she convinced her parents to let her move in with one of her friends who was living in downtown Toronto 3 days out of the week. But in reality, she would actually be living with Daniel. So 3 days out of the week, Jennifer is living with Daniel, but Daniel actually still lived with his family at this point. And he also had an Asian family. He had an Asian background. So his family was not as strict, obviously, considering they were letting Jennifer, who was his girlfriend at the time, live with them. But they were still somewhat traditional, to the point where they wanted to get to know Jennifer's family. They were asking her when they would get to meet her family that they should go out and have dinner together to really get to know each other. But the more they kind of asked about this, the more Jennifer just brushed it off and really tried to make that situation known that it was just not going to happen. So the semesters are going by, and Jennifer continues to pretend that she is living with her friend 3 days a week, going to Toronto U. She's in the pharmacology program and she's doing well, apparently. But this was only able to continue for so long because 2 years later, it was time for graduation. So what was she going to do here? How was she going to get herself out of this lie? Well, obviously, the only way she knew how, by making up another lie. So she had the grade part kind of thought out. She just was able to somehow forge her transcripts. She was able to show her parents that she was getting all A's, which were completely fake. But when it came time for graduation and that ceremony, I'm sure it's the same thing in the States and in different parts of the world. When you graduate from university or college, you go to a big ceremony with everyone in your program and you walk across the stage, you get your diploma, you have the hat, it's a big ceremony. Now, of course, Jennifer's parents were very, very excited and definitely looking forward to going to see their daughter graduate from the pharmacology program, which is a very prestigious program from a very prestigious school. So, of course, they were extremely proud of their daughter and very excited about this. Now, to get out of the situation, Jennifer actually ended up telling her parents that the university had way too many graduates that year, and that unfortunately the auditorium was not large enough to host everyone and their families. And so therefore they were limiting all of the graduates to only invite one family member. So not wanting to make her parents feel excluded, Jennifer said that she gave her ticket to a friend of hers so her friend could invite both of her parents, and then Jennifer would just sit it out. That way she didn't have to choose between which parents would get to go to her graduation. So she gets out of the graduation part, but then comes another story. And I'm not exactly sure why she decided to add this in, but it just seemed to me like she complicated her life even more by adding this story. But basically, she told her parents that she had gotten a job. I'm not sure if it was an actual job or a volunteer job that she said that she had gotten, but basically that she was going to be working at Sick Kids in Toronto, which is one of the best hospitals for children in the country, if not the world. Now, this is actually where her story starts to unravel. And this is because Jennifer was forgetting some key details. So when you work at a hospital, obviously you have a uniform, you have an ID badge, you have one of those locks that let you go in and out of secure places in the hospital. Jennifer didn't have any of these. She didn't go out of her way to forge these for some reason. It's not really known why she didn't take care of that, but her parents caught on and started to become a little bit suspicious. So one day, her father actually decided to call her friend that she was allegedly living with downtown and ask her if Jennifer was there. Her friend completely forgot about the lie. I guess she didn't realize what day it was or something, and ended up telling her father that she wasn't there, and kind of just cracked under pressure as well, and ended up telling them that Jennifer had actually never lived there. And so one day after hearing this, Jennifer's dad decided to drive her to the hospital to see for himself if she was actually working there. And Jennifer's mom was also in the car. So horrified at the idea of this, Jennifer goes along with it. They're driving up to the hospital and they drop her off on the sidewalk. She gets out and immediately starts panicking, runs out and straight into the hospital. And when she noticed that her mom was following her, she just bolted it inside to the hospital into some random room where her mom would not be able to find her, and kind of just sat there until the coast was clear. So at this point, her story had been exposed. She could no longer keep up the lies, so she was basically forced to come clean. And her parents were furious, especially her father. He was the stricter one of the two, and he basically did not want anything to do with her. He wanted to kick her out of the house, but his wife and her mother were able to calm him down a little bit, enough to let Jennifer stay in the home. So when things calmed down a little bit, Jennifer was able to tell them the story. Unfortunately, she actually didn't end up telling them the whole story. She only told them half of it. She did not tell them that she actually hadn't graduated from high school, and she did not admit that her time at Ryerson was also fake. The only thing that she told her parents was a lie was her living in downtown Toronto and her actually being accepted into Toronto U. So even though she was exposed, she still wasn't telling her parents the full story. So with her parents calming down, they decided to let her stay and give her another chance. But this time they were going to implement some very hardcore rules. Now, remember, at this point, Jennifer is in her early 20s and her parents have her on lockdown like she's 12 years old. They did the absolute most at this point. Initially, they took away her cell phone and her laptop for 2 weeks straight. She had absolutely zero access to either of these things. And then after those 2 weeks went by, she was able to access them, but only in front of her parents. They had to watch her use her cell phone and her laptop. And then she also had to endure random spot checks from her parents on her cell phone to make sure that she wasn't talking to Daniel or that she wasn't talking to any other boy, really. And on top of this, obviously, she wasn't allowed to talk to Daniel. She wasn't allowed to see him. So she was basically forbidden from leaving the house unless it was to go to her piano teaching job. And to make sure she wasn't lying about where she was going, her father actually started tracking the odometer on the car to make sure she wasn't going anywhere further than she should have been. He was full on controlling everything Jennifer was doing at this point. So obviously, as you can imagine, with these very, very strict rules, Jennifer and Daniel's relationship completely broke down to the point where Daniel ended up breaking up with her and he actually moved on fairly quickly and started dating a new girl. Obviously, this made Jennifer completely insane. She was not happy about this and it pushed her to do what she did best, to make up another story for attention and basically forced her way to get what she wanted. So the story she came up with was pretty outrageous, as her other stories were. What she said is that she was home alone one night and someone knocked at the door. So she goes to the door, she looks through the little keyhole and she sees that it's a police officer. So opening the door, thinking that she could trust this officer, she actually allegedly was rushed by not just the cop, but by a group of men where she was assaulted. After this, she actually told Daniel that she received a letter in the mail and inside was a bullet. And to top it off, she actually claimed to Daniel that this whole thing had been orchestrated by his new girlfriend as a threat or some sort of message to get Jennifer to stay away from him. Unfortunately and sadly, this kind of ended up working for Jennifer. She was able to get Daniel back, and by the time she was 24, they had decided to get back together, and this time they were going to make sure that their relationship lasted. And the way they were going to do this was by murdering Jennifer's father. So initially, Jennifer had contacted a man called Andrew that she had gone to high school with, and he was kind of a troublemaker and he knew a few other troublemakers. So he contacted another man named Ricardo, who was supposed to carry out the initial hit for approximately $1,500. From what I understood, he decided to change his mind last minute and he said that he wasn't going to do it anymore. And so Jennifer was back to square one with Daniel, trying to figure out how they were going to make this happen. So this time they decided to up the payment that they were going to give, and it went from $1,500 to $10,000. Now, Daniel started making some calls, talking to different people, and they were actually able to contact a man called Leonard Crawford. Leonard actually gives Jennifer a burner phone with a fake SIM card just so their communication wouldn't be able to be tracked so easily. And he also ends up contacting two other men called Eric and David about the plan. Now, this is where the night of the event goes into effect. So it takes place on November 8th, 2010. So Jennifer's at home. It was just her and her parents. Her brother was not home at the time. And the plan was for her to pretend like she was going to go to bed, but on her way upstairs, she actually unlocks the front door. So she does that and she goes upstairs, calls David to let him know that she's ready. And at this point, David and two other men actually entered the home, and this is when complete chaos breaks loose. It was actually determined that David was the only one that was identified in the attack, and the other two men that were with him were actually not Lenford or Eric. It was two unidentified men. So initially, the break and enter started off as a robbery. They wanted to make it seem like they were just there to steal some money, steal some valuable things, but then things took a turn. They decided to tie up Jennifer and then take her mother and her father down to the basement. Now, this is where they actually decided to shoot both of their parents. They first shot at Jennifer's mother, and she died right away because of her wounds. Then they shot her father several times, and one of the shots actually went into his face, but miraculously, he somehow survived. So, not too long into this entire ordeal, Jennifer allegedly was able to untie herself from the fake knot that they did on her, and she was actually the one that called 911. I'll actually insert an audio clip here.
What's your name?
My name is Jennifer.
So it just broke in?
Someone broke in and I heard shots like pops. I don't know what's happening. I'm tied upstairs.
Did it sound like gunshots?
I don't know what gunshot sounds like. I just heard a pop. I'm okay. My dad just went outside screaming.
Do you think your mom is downstairs too?
I don't hear her anymore. Please hurry. I don't know what's happening.
So, like I mentioned earlier, her father had survived this incredible nightmare. Somehow he had been shot in the face but was still alive. So he woke up after being unconscious for a little bit, managed to climb or drag himself up the basement stairs, up through the front door, and into his driveway, where he actually was able to wave down a neighbor who once saw him, started screaming hysterically, and they actually also ended up calling 911 as well. Now, almost instantaneously, Jennifer's story was not making sense to the police. Her story of her being tied up just was not making sense. It didn't compute to them how she was able to untie herself so easily, and they actually asked her to reenact the way she was tied and to show them how she was able to untie herself. But each time she would do it, it just wasn't making any sense. She was having a hard time reenacting it. So by the time her third police interview came around, she was actually arrested on November 22nd because of how many inconsistencies there were in her story. When she got arrested, she kind of cracked a little bit right away. She admitted that she did hire a hitman, but she said that she didn't hire the hitman to kill her parents, that she actually had hired the hitman to kill her. She was saying that she was miserable, that she hated her life, that she didn't want to live anymore, but that the entire thing went awry and it just didn't end up working out the way she thought it was supposed to. So the trial for Jennifer actually took place on March 19th, 2014, 4 years after the attacks. And it was during the trial where it was exposed that there were over 100 text messages in the hours leading up to the attack between her and Daniel, literally discussing the murder and discussing what was going to happen and how they were going to live after all of this. Basically, there was no way out of this for her. Like, she had been fully exposed. There was proof of her talking to Daniel about doing this. There was no way out. And on top of that, one of the arguments was that it was a robbery, but that just didn't make sense in the trial, because if it were an actual robbery, why would they break in, only steal about $1,500 worth of things, kill both parents, but then leave Jennifer unharmed? It just doesn't make sense to leave a witness there. So on December 13th, 2014, Jennifer was sentenced to life with no chance of parole for 25 years. Now, because of this, obviously, Jennifer's father suffers extreme anxiety. He's very, very depressed. And he actually had the judge order a ban from having Jennifer ever contacting him or her son, or his son, her brother Felix, ever again. And since then, they've just really, really had a hard time adjusting to life. And as for Jennifer, she's been in jail basically this entire time. She's not going to get out for a very long time. She's in her 30s now, but there hasn't been much follow-up after this. I haven't been able to see any interviews as to whether or not she regrets this or how she's doing in jail. But all this from having a super strict childhood. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think it was her father's fault? Do you think she just couldn't handle some pressure? I know this is a very sensitive topic, so I would love to hear your opinions. Leave your comments below. And if you guys have any other case suggestions, let me know as well in the comments. And I will see you in the next video.